So we're living in rather dark times right now. But you know what always cheers me up? Star Trek. But we're not here to talk about that today. Today we're going to talk about modern politics. Yeah, that'll sure cheer me up. You might remember that before Picard came out, there was a lot of hubbub about how political it was going to be, and how it was going to have a lot of modern day political parallels, and a lot of idiots were mad about this, I guess. Now us big smart boys know that Star Trek has always been political, and us bigger smarter boys know that all art is inherently political. To be fair, sorry, I can't do this anymore. It is for the opening bit, but it's getting in my mouth, and I can't handle it anymore. You're gonna have to learn how to do this, guys, with all your quarantine hair. And for that, I recommend not learning from me, because I'm a bad teacher. I'm gonna take the dressing gown off too, it's too hot. To be fair though, Picard does seem to be significantly more political, at least at first anyway, with talks about immigration, terrorism, racism, and predatory news media all showing up in the first episode. However, as we follow these threads throughout the show, it turns out that most of them don't really go anywhere, and turn out to be kind of pointless. Some of them even contradict what was being said in the first half of the show. So what we're going to do today is look at the political parallels in Star Trek Picard and examine how and why they don't seem to work. Let us begin.
But your initial actions were to call for a massive relocation of Romulans?
The Romulans asked for our help, and I believed we had a profound obligation to give it.
The most prevalent issue in the first half of the season is the Romulan refugee crisis, which in our current day would most likely be compared to the Syrian refugee crisis. We see a few details like the Federation's resistance to helping the Romulans evacuate.
But even before the synthetics attacked Mars, 14 species within the Federation said cut the Romulans loose or we'll pull out.
And look at the map tonight. At least 29 governors in the US now saying refugees are not welcome.
This Fox News lady trying to subtly alienate Romulans.
Many felt there were better uses for our resources than aiding the Federation's oldest enemy.
There were millions of lives at stake.
Romulan lives.
No. Lives.
And then a few episodes later, the conditions that Romulan refugees are living in, all of which are very familiar to our modern day. There's also the fact that the Romulan evacuation was postponed after an act of terror, something that you can compare to many modern day events. There's already a couple of cracks here, like the fact that the Romulans have both the resources to run the Romulan reclamation site, and are also living in slums, or that the Romulans had an empire consisting of hundreds of planets and shouldn't feasibly be in this state in the first place, or that the attack on Mars, at least in the eyes of the public, had nothing to do with Romulans. But for the sake of our parallels, these are minor things. The major problem is that after episode 4, all of this is completely dropped and even downright contradicted. In fact, during episode 4, our supposed sympathy for the Romulans is tested when we see a Romulans only sign on a bar and a former senator forcing a 92-year-old man into a sword fight who then gets his head cut off. Things just go downhill from here. At this point, the Romulans are just the bad guys with no sympathetic angles whatsoever, especially since the Romulan housekeepers are gone from the show. The Romulans we have left are mass murderers, manipulators,
You do that for me.
and spies.
And if the need arises, I will take care of Picard.
And we also see that the Romulans have a fleet of ships and clearly have a vast amount of power and influence, which they were planning to use to completely annihilate a planet.
General, they appear to be concentrated in one settlement.
Sterilize the entire planet.
The show also, and I really hope this wasn't intentional, kind of empowers deep state conspiracy theorists, since Raffi's paranoid theory that got her kicked out of Starfleet addicted to drugs and living in a trailer was that Romulans had infiltrated Starfleet and were behind the attack on Mars, which turned out to be completely true.
Where do we begin?
On the world the humans call Mars.
So what's this saying about refugees and racism towards them? Well, is it not kind of saying that it's justified? Like, this isn't a hashtag not all Romulan situation here. A fleet of hundreds of ships were about to destroy a planet.
Ready planetary sterilization pattern number 5.
And in that scene where they genocided a bunch of Borg drones, the evil sister, aka the worst character on the show, wasn't even the one who suggested killing all the Borg drones.
We have to get rid of every Borg still held in stasis immediately.
Can they be gassed? Electrocuted?
We can blow the seals and jettison them directly into space.
Oh, I like that.
In what might be one of the most disturbing scenes in the show.
Sector 3 maintenance regulators will report to mandatory security training at
Good morning, plastic people.
Good morning, Mr. Pincus.
Androids are also used early on as a race allegory, especially heavily at the start of episode 2, where we see that before the synth ban, the synths were victims of constant abuse and mockery, and appear to be essentially slaves. There's also the fact that androids are hunted down and killed just for being what they are. I don't automatically have a problem with this, but like most media with this approach, there's a serious problem with conflating robots or AI with racial issues, and it's that, to put it simply, artificial intelligence is fundamentally different from us. Staying in the fiction, a Romulan and a human may have biological differences and different cultures, but they're both still linked. They're both biological, and they're both descended from the ancient humanoids, whom all life in the Star Trek universe is descended from. Androids are creations. They were built and designed by humans, and they're significantly more dangerous than a Romulan ever could be. They are exponentially more intelligent than a biological creature, and are also completely unpredictable. As many sci-fi stories have shown us, an out-of-control AI can be your worst nightmare. When it comes to the rights and liberties of artificial life, the argument isn't about the colour of their skin or the pointiness of their ears, it's about what it even means to be alive. At what point do lines of code constitute consciousness? If we look at, say, Fallout 4, another story dealing with the same issue, we can see that their argument isn't about their skull circumference or other nonsense. It's about their consciousness, if they're able to think about what it means to be alive, if they have a soul.
I know it'll be a difficult adjustment for you, but try to remember that synths aren't people.
Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that unlike typical racism, there are legitimate reasons to fear AIs. Something the show couldn't be clearer in demonstrating, since it takes all but 5 seconds for Soji to be convinced to commit Mass Effect genocide against the entire biological population.
Let's say they eliminate the threat of extermination that all organic life forms ultimately pose.
Did you just say all?
Back before the show came out, Patrick Stewart specifically mentioned Trump, and the only parallel I can think of in the show to Trump is Admiral Clancy, although if that's what they were going for, they failed spectacularly, because she isn't really Trump at all. More likely she's a weird amalgam of a general feeling of resentment towards inept world leaders. She's racist, she's being manipulated by foreign spies, but most importantly she says fuck with more vitriol than I could even manage.
Sheer fucking hubris.
But ultimately this goes nowhere and doesn't really say anything. Off screen in the last episode, the Federation decides to lift the synth ban, but the audience doesn't get to see the whys and the whats. So this parallel to corrupt world leaders doesn't end up saying anything about them, other than a vague acknowledgement that they exist, which, yeah, no shit. Just for fun though, I'll point out that they only decide that androids are allowed to have rights after they've demonstrated the power and desire to genocide all of them, just because they thought a single biological prisoner killed one of them. Is that a yikes? Let's call it a half yikes.
There's no more despised people in the galaxy than the XBs. People either see us as property to be exploited, or as a hazard to be warehoused.
Right then, let's talk about the Borg. So I honestly have no idea what they were trying to say with the Borg, or more specifically the X-Borg in this show. Realistically, I understand the Borg are only in this show because it's a thing people know, and it's there so that they can market the Borg. But there is hints that they are trying to say something with the Borg in the show. I just can't tell what that is. Is this another parallel to immigration? That doesn't really work since the X-Borg would be returning home and not moving to a new one. Is it trying to say something about autism or other mental disorders? Not really, because we see from the several completely normal ex-Borg in the show that this phase of walking around and acting like a Borgtron is temporary, not something we'll have to live with forever. Is it about PTSD and trauma? Possibly, but if they're saying that all it takes for veterans to get over trauma is a conversation with an old friend and seeing some other vets getting better, then that's a bit weak. Then, of course, there's the forbidden reading.
The Borg thing might not be a thing like the immigration thing. I think it might be a thing for... I can't believe we're discussing this, but is it a thing for the trans community? And then that bit where the Romulan that XB calls him Locutus, is that... Are they dead naming him? Like, I knew you would before I said it, I said, right, this will get a little chuckle from you, Kyle. But I'm kind of serious.
You might not even be wrong, and if that's the case, oh god. But that still doesn't really work, since if anything, leaving the collective is a detransition back to your original identity. If you know what the point of the Borg was in the show, could you please explain it to me, because I don't understand. The final thing I want to discuss is the issues that get a tiny amount of screen time, which feel a lot more like flavour, or dare I say edge for the sake of edge, that don't really say anything about a particular issue. These would include Raffi's drug addiction. This is a detail shown several times in the early episodes, but like a lot of things, it's dropped before the end of the show and doesn't ultimately say anything about it. Raffi might be shown smoking on this vape several times, but it never impacts her ability to do her job, or is even made a big deal about by anyone on the show. Wealth inequality. The show points out the unfairness of Picard living on a massive inherited estate while Raffi lives in a trailer.
Sitting back in your very fine chateau. It's big. Oak beams, heirloom furniture. Yeah, I'd show you around my estate, but it's more of a hovel, so that would just be, humiliating.
But it's never brought up again, and there's no payoff to it. Alcoholism. There's a heavy amount of drinking in this show, and not the fun kind of drinking people do at parties. Heavy, getting drunk to forget kind of drinking. Just like Raffi's drug problem, though, nothing is said about it. It's just flavour. Raffi even manages to solve an issue for the crew while being super drunk, and I think it was meant to be funny. Suicide. So, suicide shows up a hell of a lot in this show, and it's handled incredibly poorly, to the point that if you're someone who's dealing with or has dealt with suicidal thoughts, then I would recommend you steer clear of this show, and maybe the rest of this video. Things are about to get a bit dark. Suicide is used with as much finesse as your average B horror movie, by which I mean there's literally a scene where a coven of witches violently kill themselves because the madness takes them. Which makes it especially jarring when in that same episode the show uses suicide as a tragic backstory for Rios.
I went at him hard. Pretty hard. That's when he put the phaser in his mouth and pulled the trigger.
Why would you put a phaser in your mouth? That's not how phasers work. Whatever, completely off topic. Rios' old captain killed himself out of extreme guilt after being ordered to kill innocent dignitaries. Though apparently he didn't feel bad enough about it to ignore his obviously evil orders, but again, that's off topic, goddammit. Had this been the only use of suicide in the show, I probably would have been fine with it. It's a bit grimdark, but it works as part of Rios' and the overarching story. Of course, it's not the only time, because there's the Coven, as well as at least 3 more. There's this time when the crazy lady puts a phaser to her head because she's crazy, with absolutely no deeper meaning or motivation than that. It just took longer for the madness to take her than the rest of the Coven, I guess. There's this conversation between Seven and Elnor.
Am I better off dead? I'm an XP. I have no home. I don't belong anywhere. And I just put a phaser to my head and get it over with.
Because I'd miss you.
This one's doubly not great because for one it serves as a real slap in the face to Voyager fans.
I'm an XP. I have no home. I don't belong anywhere.
Haven't we endured enough? But also because it promotes some deeply unhealthy beliefs about depression. The idea that you should keep on living for the benefit of others is not great, and if I was Seven's friend, I'd be instructing her to seek professional help here and not just that she should live on because I'd miss her. That wouldn't make for very exciting or dramatic television, obviously, but it would be a much healthier portrayal of depression and how you should handle the situation. The final time turns out to be the final dramatic beat of the show, when the simulation of Data asks to die, with the final moral of the show being that life is only worthwhile if it's finite, which, quick aside, could someone explain the logic of this to me, because it doesn't make any sense at all.
Butterfly that lives forever. Is really not a butterfly at all.
At first glance, this looks like a commentary on euthanasia, by which I mean it literally looks like euthanasia. The pulling things out of a computer is visually similar to turning off life support, but looking a little bit deeper, that's not really what's happening. There's no sign that Data's suffering or in pain, nor is it ever made clear that Data couldn't be transferred into a new body. Based on what's said and shown, he could go back to being regular old Data. So in actuality, this is another case of suicide. Data is stuck in the simulation and wants to die. Maybe because he's bored, maybe he's depressed, maybe because he really does absolutely buy into his philosophy and sees now as good a time as any.
You want to die?
Not exactly, sir. I want to live, however briefly, knowing that my life is finite.
The reason doesn't actually matter. His wish is granted with no pushback from Picard on the issue. I've mentioned a couple times already things that I think are being said by the show regardless of what the writers intended, but this is probably my biggest reach, so keep that in mind. Let's look at this scene down to its absolute core. A friend asks another friend to kill him, and the friend says yes. In the absence of disease or suffering or even mental health issues, we're only given the philosophy that life is given meaning by death.
Mortality gives meaning to human life, Captain.
And so, whether intentional or not, the show is suggesting that suicide is okay because it gives life meaning. I've deliberately avoided making comparisons to previous Star Treks in this video because, quite honestly, I'd just be making the same point over and over again. Immigration, watch this episode. Racism, watch this episode. Drug addiction, wealth disparity, suicide, watch these episodes. I have to break that rule here. The philosophy espoused by Data here is supposed to be a continuation of this conversation with Geordi and TNG, where they find Data's head in a cave.
Are you referring to the foreknowledge of my death? I have no particular desire to discuss the matter. Do you need to talk about it?
Yeah.
Why?
Data, this has got to bother you a little.
On the contrary, I find it rather comforting.
Comforting?
I have often wondered about my own mortality as I have seen others around me age. Until now, it has been theoretically possible that I would live an unlimited period of time. And although some might find this attractive, to me it only reinforces the fact that I am artificial.
I never knew how tough this must be for you.
Tough? As in difficult?
Knowing that you would outlive all your friends.
I expected to make new friends.
True.
And then to outlive them as well.
Now that you know that you might not?
It provides a sense of completion to my future. In a way, I am not that different from anyone else. I can now look forward to death.
Never thought of it that way.
One might also conclude that it brings me one step closer to being human.
The problem is there's a massive difference between accepting and even being comfortable with mortality in his quest to be more human, and asking to die specifically because it gives life meaning. TNG Data doesn't want to die. If he did, he could do it literally whenever he wanted. He takes comfort in knowing that it's out of his control just like everyone else. It's why, far from finding this scene powerful and dramatic, I find it deeply disturbing. How Star Trek Picard fails to carry on the ideas and themes of previous Star Treks is an issue for a different video. Maybe even this video. For now, let's get back on track. Picard uses suicide as a dramatic story element, or just for shock value, in the same way it uses murder. The huge problem with that is that while watching a murder on TV doesn't motivate people to murder, the same cannot be said for a poorly handled depiction of suicide. And this show swings way too close to the suicide gives you power argument for my liking. Which again, I have to reiterate, I don't believe was the writer's intention. I don't know that for sure though, and that goes for all the writer's intentions throughout the show. Ultimately, these hot button issues are given such a shallow representation that it's almost impossible to understand what the writer's intentions even were. Watching the show is a very similar experience to playing Far Cry 5, where things look and sound heavy and full of meaning. But when you actually think about it, it's hard to say if anything is even being said at all. Then again, two women held hands at the end, so clearly it's a transgressive masterpiece. What the fuck do I know?
But blue sky.
And depressed and murdering people up for revenge and talking about wanting to kill herself, and it's like, no, this isn't what I want. This isn't why I watch Star Trek.
But it's supposed to reflect the reality of today. We're so darker.
This is what I might actually make a video on, is the real world comparisons that were a big deal